There's a saying which goes, "You don't get the right answers if you don't ask the right questions." In this context, it means we need to use relevant testing conditions to make sure the data we gather is meaningful and accurate. We need to consider: which devices should we test with? The latest iPhone? Older devices maybe? What network speed should we use? 4G? 3G? 2G? Where should we test from? If our website is sat on a server in London, but we're targeting users in South Africa, that's going to affect server connection times, for instance. Which browsers should we use to capture metrics? Chrome? Safari? Internet Explorer? All of them? The answer to all of these questions is this. It's important to test under conditions which are representative of your users. Otherwise, you won't get an accurate picture of their loading experience. So, what would representative testing conditions look like? Let's start with device type. A good first step is to check your Google Analytics account. From here, you can get some basic data on the types of devices being used to access your website. Though beware, as it may not provide a complete picture. Why? Users may currently be abandoning the website because loading is too slow, which means these devices aren't being recorded on analytics, so go unnoticed. After all, remember that Google found that over 50% of users abandon a website if it takes longer than 3 seconds to load. However, if analytics data is unavailable, is there another way to discover the best representative device? We instead look at what is most common in the general population. According to research from IDC, globally from 2018 to 2019, 87% of all shipped mobile phones are Android devices. And with mobile phone sales falling, at least in the US and Europe, it appears users are waiting longer than ever before to upgrade their phones. According to data from CNBC, devices are being used for an average of 24 months before being upgraded, meaning there's plenty of 2-year-old devices out there and likely many more which are even older. And when people do buy phones, if we look back at some of the best-selling mobile devices on Amazon, the majority are sub £200 budget devices. Some are even sub £100. The Moto G5, Samsung Galaxy A40, Alcatel One X. These are all good contenders for a representative device. You may ask, why should we test on older devices? People just aren't using them anymore, right? Even if that were true, which it isn't, consider this example. Even today, the performance of the older iPhone models is still slightly better than today's budget phones when loading some of the bigger websites like CNN.com. Yesterday's flagship devices from half a decade ago are today's budget devices, and any optimizations done which improve performance on these lower powered budget devices will just cascade upwards and benefit more capable ones. If it's not possible to test on these types of devices directly, then consider using CPU throttling functionality alongside tools such as Lighthouse so your actual testing device is more in line with your representative device. Google Analytics doesn't provide any meaningful data on the connection speeds of users visiting your website. So like with devices, we'll have to use research as our source. Using data from this report by GSMA, we can see that connection speeds vary wildly by region. For example, in 2019, in North America, 4G accounted for 82% of all mobile connections, with 3G at 12% and 2G at 6%. Europe generally follows the same pattern, but with less 4G penetration at 58%. 3G is at 28% here, and 2G connections accounted for 14%. In other regions though, 4G is less dominant. Latin America, 47% 4G, 35% 3G, and 17% 2G. Middle East and North Africa, 29% 4G, 40% 3G, and 31% 2G. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, 4G accounted for only 10% of mobile connections, whilst 3G accounted for 46%. Meanwhile, a massive 45% are still using 2G. To put it briefly, this data shows that as of 2019, slower connections are still very much alive and well, and for the time being are here to stay. With all this in mind, we ought to optimise for the worst possible scenario. If you're targeting areas like North America or Europe, start off by testing on a throttled 3G connection with around a 300 millisecond round-trip delay, 1.6 megabyte per second download speed, and a 0.8 megabyte per second upload speed, before shifting to faster connections to get a more complete view. Whilst if you're targeting outside of these regions, or worldwide, start lower and test your website performance on 2G, which roughly equates to a 280 kilobyte per second download speed, 256 kilobyte per second upload, and 800 millisecond round-trip delay. You can manually throttle your connection speeds on your desktop and mobile device using software, which we'll cover in depth in a later video. Location is a factor in web performance testing because location is a factor on the web. When a user loads a website, the further away they are geographically from the host server, the more latency is introduced, meaning HTTP request and response times between the browser and server will take longer. For example, a US-hosted website visited by a US-based user will yield a much faster time-to-first byte metric than a user on the other side of the world. This is why CDNs are so widespread. By creating copies of your website on multiple servers across the world, connection times are reduced, assets can be transferred sooner, which means the website can be loaded faster. So where should tests be run from? For example, for a US-based website, which is only targeting US residents, the decision is pretty cut and dry: the US. For websites which target a worldwide audience, however, things get a little more complicated. Unless you have access to financial data, you aren't likely to know which countries are more important markets for the business. In this instance, it's a question which marketing or stakeholders may have to answer for you. Alternatively, you could select the countries which provide the most visits. This data can be retrieved from Google Analytics via the Audience, Geo, Location menu option. In tools such as Web Page Test, which I'll introduce properly later in the course, you can test from devices located throughout the world. If that's not an option, then the next best solution could be a VPN located within the target country. For existing websites with Google Analytics, you can find out which browsers visitors are using under the Audiences tab, followed by Technology, and then Browser and OS. If there's a clear-cut winner, then great, there's your representative browser. If not, then run a few audits using, say, the top 3 and capture some key performance metrics. If the results are consistent across these browsers, then you can rule out performance irregularities and just pick one to use for future audits. What if you don't have analytics data? Then we need to fall back on browser stats research to best determine a representative browser instead. The more localized the data is to your target market, the better. For example, in the UK, research into browser usage by StatCounter from November 2019 shows the following breakdown. Using this data, it can make sense to use Chrome and occasionally Safari as the representative browser for performance testing.